Today we're going to be talking about post-revolutionary France, that is, France after the French Revolution. We're going to start by talking about the rise of Napoleon. Going back to the end of the French Revolution, in 1794, if you remember, the Jacobin leader Maximilien Robespierre was executed as he was becoming too radical and too violent. This was during that time period when thousands of people were being executed by the guillotine, and he was also doing things like changing the calendar and trying to get rid of religion. After Robespierre was executed, you have the establishment of what is known as the Directory. This is the third government in 3 years for the people of France. The Directory itself was made up of a two-house legislature similar to our Senate. You also had an executive body made up of 5 men. While not the best kind of government, there was corruption. It did lead to a period of peace, which was really important following that reign of terror. Napoleon Bonaparte actually grew up during the French Revolution. He was born in 1769 in Corsica and spent most of his youth in either military school or eventually into the military. And in October of 1795, when there was an attempted rebellion at the National Convention, he helped to use his military skills to put down that rebellion that the Royalists had led, the Royalists being the people who still supported the idea of a monarchy. At this point, he's sort of deemed a national hero and called the savior of the French Republic. That following year, when there was an issue between France, Austria, and Sardinia, he was appointed to lead the French army against those two nations. This is when he had that famous crossing of the Alps, and he won against those two nations. You've probably seen this picture before, which is a painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Even though most people know this picture, this is probably what it looked more like. Using a horse to cross the Alps wasn't a good idea. It's very treacherous, it's snow-covered, and in order for an animal to make it over the Alps, you probably had to use some kind of donkey. And that's what you see on the picture on the right-hand side. He also didn't know his way through the Alps, so he had to use a guide. But that's not what you see in the famous pictures. Instead, you see this heroic person, kind of taking charge over the Alps to win. By 1799, people had lost confidence in this new government, in the Directory. And in November of that year, Napoleon's troops, who, remember, he had become sort of this national hero, he's leading the way and surrounds the legislature, drives out its members, and dissolves the Directory. This time, we have a new government for France. It's a group of 3 consuls, similar to, if you remember from 9th grade, when Caesar led with 2 other consuls. Napoleon is the first consul, and he rules like a dictator. This is called a coup d'etat, or a sudden seizure of power. Coup d'etat literally translates into a blow to the state or a blow to the government. So in 1800, he decides that over the period of the French Revolution, one of the things that was a big issue was a more democratic kind of government. So he decides to hold a plebiscite, or a vote of the people, to approve a new constitution and a new leader. Needless to say, people agreed to this new constitution and gave power to Napoleon. It really wasn't as democratic as he made it seem. It's not like there were elections where people were out trying to get people to vote for them or things like that. Basically, you had one choice: Napoleon and his new constitution. And in 1804, he takes it to the next level. This time, he decides to name himself Emperor. Again, sounds a lot like Caesar. And on December 12th of that year, he was crowned at the Notre Dame Cathedral. Now, up until this point, most Catholic kings were crowned by the Pope. But instead, when the Pope went to place the crown on his head, he actually took it from him and placed it on his own head, showing the Pope and the people that there is nothing higher than Napoleon, nothing higher than him as an emperor. And this is a really powerful act. Here's a picture of Napoleon. Again, notice how here's a person who is supposedly democratically chosen, but he looks more like a king. He's wearing a similar crown as Julius Caesar used to wear. He's got his hand over the cross, again showing his power and his stature. Some of the changes that were made under Napoleon. Let's look at them socially, politically, and economically. Socially, that is for the people, some things changed, like education. Napoleon opened what are called lycees, or government-run schools. These schools were open to all male students, and what's unique about these is that people who went to school and graduated from these schools were placed in government jobs, ensuring that people who had these government jobs were educated. He also made an agreement with, or concordat with, the Pope, saying that the church could not get involved in government affairs. Politically, he's enacted something called the Napoleonic Code. A uniform set of laws for all of the French Empire. Law codes are a good thing, but this particular law code actually limited a lot of the liberties and individual rights that were won during the French Revolution. Economically, there was a new method of tax collection that was put into place, and if you think about it, this was necessary. Going back to some of the causes of the French Revolution, one of the main issues was that the Third Estate had to pay all of the taxes. So, under Napoleon's rule, there was a new method of tax collection that was devised. He developed a national banking system and helped to end government corruption through the use of these lycees. So, at this time, the French ruler, Napoleon, had basically two parts of the world where he was emperor. You have the colonies in the New World, and then you have Europe. So let's look at the New World Empire first. Going back to 1789, the colony of Saint-Dominique, or what we now know as Haiti, was a French colony, a French sugar colony, which means this was a big moneymaker for France. But while the French Revolution is occurring in France, you also have an impact on this New World colony. And under the National Assembly, that is the National Assembly that was developed at the first part of the French Revolution, the people who lived in the colony now had the same rights as the people of France. And this is where you see an overthrow, or an attempted overthrow, of the government in the colony by somebody named Toussaint Louverture. He led enslaved Africans to overthrow the French government there and take control of the colony. Over the next couple of days, after we get done talking about Napoleon, we'll start talking about some other Latin American revolutions, including this one that occurred. In 1801, Napoleon attempts to take back the colony. So this is when he first starts to come back into rule as leader of France. And he attempts to take back the colony because this really is a big money maker. But the problem is he loses. He's in a new land where he doesn't know the territory, he doesn't know the terrain, and the people of Haiti are just really good fighters, especially compared to the gentlemanly kind of war that you see going on in Europe. So Napoleon's army is devastated by disease, and he ends up losing. Additionally, only 2 years later, he decides to sell the Louisiana Territory to President Jefferson, something that most people know about. The Louisiana Territory was sold to the U.S. for $15 million. This was a two-part benefit for the French. First, it gives them money that they need. But it also punishes the British. And remember that the French and the British have historically not liked one another. This was a way for Napoleon, who disliked the British, to sort of cement the idea that their former colony was going to be a world power. Napoleon even said, "The sale assures forever the power of the United States, and I have given in England a rival who sooner or later will humble her pride." Let's jump back over to the European Empire. Once he comes in and starts taking over France itself, he decides he's going to move outside of the French borders. He starts by annexing the Austrian Netherlands and parts of Italy that are near France. He sets up puppet governments in Switzerland. And a puppet government is a kind of government where another nation doesn't necessarily have direct control over that nation, but instead they put in a leader that they can control. Now, at this point, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden decide that enough is enough. He can't go out and start taking over these sovereign, independent nations. So they join together versus France. But you have to remember, Napoleon is one of the best military minds in history. And even against these forces, Napoleon crushes them. And he goes on to build the largest empire since Rome. Austria, Prussia, and Russia are forced to sign peace treaties with France, leaving only one major enemy for Napoleon. And it's none other than Great Britain. So Napoleon decides to take on Britain, but he doesn't do it with a whole lot of intelligence, because as good as Napoleon is as a military fighter, an army kind of fighter, a fighter that is used to fighting on land, England is known for their navy. And you have the British Navy, who is led by Horatio Nelson, versus the French Navy, who's led by Napoleon. And Napoleon just doesn't have that kind of naval mind. So, excuse me, when they come at one another during this battle, the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson starts by splitting the French Navy, splits them apart from one another, and he captures most of their ships. 20 out of the 33 ships that the French bring are captured by Nelson. During this time, though, Nelson is killed during battle. If you go to Trafalgar Square in London, there's a 17-foot high statue on a 185-foot tall column that has a statue of Nelson on it, commemorating this battle. So what did this battle do? The effects of this battle were, one, is one of the only major battle losses for Napoleon. Two, it ensures British naval supremacy, that basically the British Navy is nothing to mess around with. And Napoleon had to give up taking over Great Britain, at least for the time being. His desire, though, to take over Britain would eventually lead to his downfall. So let's look at what the French Empire looks like during this point in time. By 1812, the only areas in Europe that are not under French control are Britain, Portugal, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire. He has open alliances with Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and puppet governments set up in Spain, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and many of the Central European Germanic kingdoms. So this is what what Europe looked like by 1812. Anything that is in the blue and the pink is either part of the French Empire, an alliance of the French Empire, or in some way, shape, or form controlled by Napoleon. The only areas that are not are the areas in that peach color. Now, Napoleon, by the early 1800s, did not have a male heir by his wife Josephine. So he ends up divorcing her and makes an alliance with Austria by marrying Marie Louise, who is the grandniece of Marie Antoinette. By 1811, he has a son, Napoleon II, who he names King of Rome. From this point on, you have the fall of Napoleon. Things are going to go downhill for him. And he makes three major mistakes. His first mistake goes back to Great Britain. In November of 1806, he decides to set up a naval blockade against Great Britain and other European nations. Basically, what he's trying to do is he blocks off trade and communication between Britain and Europe. This was called the Continental System. Basically, he's trying to make continental Europe more self-sufficient by cutting them off from the British economy. During this point in time, Britain is starting to industrialize. So many of the manufactured goods that the Europeans had been consuming, been buying, came from Great Britain. Needless to say, this did not work. Two reasons. One, people ignored the blockade. They wanted those goods that were coming from Great Britain. Two, Britain sets up its own blockade. Again, they have the strongest navy in the entire world at this point, so it makes sense. And by them setting up their own blockade, this one was actually more successful. On a side note, it's during this time when British ships start to stop neutral American ships to search them because of this whole blockade between Britain and Europe that the War of 1812 actually breaks out. This is a sort of a political cartoon referring to the Continental System. This is Napoleon, and you can tell from his big hat. Anytime you see him in political cartoons and drawings, he's always shown with this gigantic hat. This is England, and it's hard to see, but labeled in pink, kind of where they're holding on, it's labeled England. And again, this refers to that continental system. Napoleon's second mistake comes in 1808 with the Peninsular War. Portugal, which is on the Iberian Peninsula along with Spain, refuses to accept the continental system. So, to help put more influence on the Iberian Peninsula, Napoleon decides to remove the Spanish king and instead replaces him with his own brother. Now, the people of Portugal and Spain especially are not happy about this. They don't want to be ruled by a French king. So the Spanish end up fighting back, and they don't use, again, that gentlemanly kind of military tactics where you warn one another that you're going to fight, you agree to meet at a certain point, and this is when you battle. Instead, they use guerrillas and guerrilla tactics. These are more loosely kind of organized fighters who use surprise attacks, tripwires, jump out of trees kind of thing to fight. And on their side was the fact that the British actually supported them. The French lose 300,000 men in this war, and this severely weakens Napoleon's military. His third, final, and most costly mistake comes when he tangles with the Russians. Alexander I of Russia had been selling grain to Great Britain. And as part of the continental system, they were expected not to do that. He refuses. So, when he refuses, of course, Napoleon's not going to just accept that. And in June of 1812, Napoleon starts to invade Russia. And Alex actually does something really, really smart. Rather than attacking Napoleon, he pulls back his troops. And as he's retreating further and further inland to Russia, he employs something called the scorched earth policy, where as he retreats, he burns and destroys everything in his path. Farms, food, homes, everything is destroyed. And it seems kind of a counteractive thing to destroy your own land, but these invading militaries don't bring shelters with them. They don't bring enough food with them. So they live off of what they capture. And if everything is destroyed, they have nothing to live off of. By September 14th of 1812, Napoleon finally reaches Moscow, but he finds it in flames when he gets there. He stays in Moscow until mid-October. And this doesn't seem like a big deal, except that middle of October in Russia is cold. And this, he decides now to head back to France in the middle of the Russian winter. And remember that he starts out in June. So they've been gone for several months, and they left in their summer uniforms. But now they're stuck in the middle of a Russian winter. By the time they make it back to France, only about 10,000 of the original 420,000 actually made it back. Napoleon's downfall comes when this time the British, Russians, Prussians, and Austrians, along with the Swedish, all join forces against Napoleon. They see this as a prime opportunity now that his military is so severely weakened by the invasion of Russia and the Iberian or the Peninsular War. So in October of 1813, this weakened French army faces the combined army at Leipzig, and because of the sheer numbers, the French are easily defeated. In 1814, Prussian and Russian forces finally reach Paris, and in April of that year, Napoleon is forced to surrender and give up the throne. He's then exiled to Elba, that is an island in the Mediterranean. So now we need a new leader of France, and that new leader comes in the form of Louis XVIII. This guy is not very popular. And he's so unpopular that people actually want Napoleon back. So in March of 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba and arrives back in France, to people basically welcoming him, saying, come on, yes, you can be our emperor again. Within days, he's emperor again. People, even though they don't necessarily like absolute monarchs or like these kind of emperors, they crave stability. And that's why you see people accepting leaders like Napoleon or Hitler or other sort of tyrants, because they need that stability. The European powers, though, are not going to just accept Napoleon back. He's caused a lot of problems. So they once again join together against Napoleon. June 18th, 1815, you have the famous Battle of Waterloo. This is Napoleon of France versus the Duke of Wellington of the British. And once the two start fighting, those two and their armies, eventually the Prussians arrive to help the British, and with those two together, the British and the Prussians, they are able to defeat Napoleon. They, though, have learned their lesson. They're not this time going to exile Napoleon to an island out in the middle of the Mediterranean where he can so easily make it back. Instead, he gets the boot. And this boot kicks him all the way to the South Atlantic, to an island called St. Helena, which is well below the equator, down towards the middle part of Africa. There, he lives and writes his memoirs until his death of some kind of stomach ailment in 1821. Some people say he was poisoned on purpose. Others say it was cancer. Some say that he may have been accidentally poisoned because during this time period, certain dyes had arsenic in them, and one of those kinds of dyes that had arsenic in them was green wallpaper dye, which is what was found in his home. With the warm, moist climate of that area of the world, some people believe that the moisture may have actually caused the arsenic to leach out and caused his death. Thanks.